So Art Neumann, who's the good-looking guy in this photograph, was the last founder of Trout Unlimited. And I had the privilege of meeting Art for the first time at our 50th anniversary celebration in Michigan. And when I was there, Art gave me a copy of something called The Philosophy of Trout Unlimited, which he signed for me, and I had it framed, and it hangs above my desk. And I just want to share with you part of what The Philosophy of Trout Unlimited says. Art wrote, "Trout Unlimited believes that trout fishing isn't just fishing for trout. It's fishing for sport rather than food, where the true enjoyment of the sport lies in the challenge, the lure, and the battle of wits, not necessarily the full creel. It is the feeling of satisfaction that comes from limiting your kill instead of killing your limit. It's communing with nature, where the chief reward is a refreshed body and a contented soul, where a license is a permit to use, not abuse, to enjoy, not destroy, our trout waters. It's subscribing to the proposition that what's good for trout is good for trout fishermen, and that managing trout for the trout rather than for the fishermen is fundamental to the solution of our trout problems. It's appreciating our trout, respecting fellow anglers, and giving serious thought to tomorrow." So Chris Radke and Howard Johnson, two of our wonderful Michigan volunteers, called me early this year to say that Art wasn't doing well and that I should come out and see him. And so I had the pleasure of spending a few hours with him one morning early this spring. And he was remarkably lucid and sharp. And right before I left, by the way, he was 99 years old. Right before I left, he patted me on the knee and he said, "What are you going to do to keep up the fight for trout?" But the thing about Art was, it wasn't really about the fight for trout that motivated him. It was the band of brothers and sisters united in common cause and affection and love for trout and the places that they are found that led to the creation of Trout Unlimited. And these few hours that I got to spend with Art were among the most memorable of my professional career. And so it's in Art's memory that I'd like to give this talk today. Art passed away in March, and his legacy is one that we all carry on today. This is something that we discussed yesterday. We call it the Project Finder. Behind this map is a database that allows us to track the accomplishments of the organization, and they are significant. This is just a small sampling of what we've been able to accomplish at a national scale. And if you actually went into this database, which is accessible through our website, you'd learn about these specific and discrete projects. But let me just give you a sum of what your organization was able to accomplish just this past year. Over 7.5 million acres of land were protected. Over 815 miles of river were reconnected for fish so that they can access spawning and rearing habitat. And over 530 miles of restoration was accomplished. Now, Art was fond of saying that we should get out in front and lead and not follow. Let's promulgate sound new ideas in fisheries management and ram them home with all the political, legal, and evangelistic pressure we can muster. Let's make our enemies counter our moves instead of vice versa. Let's attack instead of counterattack. Let's be offensive instead of defensive. Let's be positive and not negative. And it's with that spirit that I would like to share with you some of the accomplishments of the organization over the past year. We've talked about the Klamath multiple times in this venue. In 2010, we secured an agreement to take out the 4 dams on the Klamath that would open up about 500 miles of habitat that has been lost for a century to salmon and steelhead. We gave this package that was in a box and wrapped in a bow to Congress, and Congress did what it does, which is nothing. The agreement that secured that agreement, we basically ran out of time. It timed out in 2015. But we didn't give up. We took the knowledge that we had learned in another project, the Penobscot, which I'll discuss in just a moment, and we formed an organization that took ownership of these dams, and we now will be able to take them out in 4 short years. In 2020, we will begin taking down the 4 dams that have blocked over 500 miles of habitat for spawning fish, for spawning salmon and steelhead. Importantly, this isn't just about the dam removal. The agreement also secured almost $500 million in increases in ratepayers' fees, as well as a water bond from California that will allow that work to move forward. Again, another project that we've talked about many times here, the Penobscot. This is another multifaceted partnership that involved states, federal agencies, multi-federal agencies, utilities, American Indian tribes, and a whole host of conservation organizations. We succeeded in taking down 2 of the 3 dams that blocked 1,100 miles of habitat for spawning anadromous fish in that basin, which is the 2nd largest watershed in New England, in 2012 and then 2013. And this year we completed the final phase of the project, which you see here. This is a bypass around the Howland Dam. Now, lest you think that these things don't work, I just want to share with you what we've seen by way of fish returning since this work has been accomplished. And these statistics are fairly recent, within the last week or 2. We've had over 500 Atlantic salmon pass places they had never passed before, over 1,700 striped bass, 1.9 million alewives, and 8,000 American shad. And to give you a frame of reference for what that means, in the previous 30 years to this year, 20 American shad had reached the point that they reached this year, that 8,000 reached this year. One of our newer initiatives is the Wild Steelhead Initiative. And the concept behind this is fairly simple. The idea was, many of you probably steelhead fish. And steelhead anglers are a different breed. These are people who willingly stand in freezing water, typically in snarly weather, casting combinations of feather and wire, and they're thrilled when on the 700th cast, they feel a bump. The idea was, can we harness that same passion for these fish and the places that these fish are found and direct it toward advocacy for protecting the wild fish in particular? We don't have anything against put-and-take fisheries or people who want to kill a fish now and again, but there ought to be certain rivers that are managed specifically for wild fish. And this year, due in part to that great, great work of all of those steelhead anglers, we were able to secure protections as wild fisheries for the Skagit River and the Olympic Peninsula. A major, major accomplishment. These are now no-kill areas for wild fish. The man you see with that perfect line behind him is Frank Moore. He has been a tireless advocate for the North Umpqua. He's a decorated World War II veteran, and within the next year, we are confident that we will secure protections for 100,000 acres on the North Umpqua of the Frank Moore Wild Steelhead Sanctuary. One final thing I want to mention, a lot of these administrative processes that we get involved in can be arcane and obscure, but the Board of Forestry in the state of Oregon was considering a proposal to move riparian protections from 20 feet, which is a fairly small distance, to 60 or 80 on larger rivers. And it was a very controversial proposal. The timber industry opposed it, but anglers turned out and showed up, and as a result of that, this year we secured additional riparian protections on 14,000 miles of streams in Oregon. Another project that we've spoken of in the past is the effort to recover Yellowstone cutthroat trout. This used to be one of the stronghold populations of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the Yellowstone Basin. Unfortunately, in the span of 30 years, we saw a 90 to 95% decline in populations of those fish, largely because of the introduction of lake trout. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we started working with our partners at the Yellowstone National Park Foundation and the Park Service, and we secured the services of some commercial fishermen. And if there's one thing that we have done very, very well in this country, it's overexploited our commercial fishing stocks. So we applied those same techniques in the Yellowstone Basin, and now for the past 5 or 6 years, we are annually catching 300,000 pounds of lake trout. And the results have been phenomenal. This year, one of our TU employees, a man by the name of Walt Gasson, took a pack trip in 30 miles to the thoroughfare in the Yellowstone. He said that they saw fish in every pool of the river. The smallest fish they caught was 17 inches. The largest were two 25-inch fish. And Walt claims, and we have to give him, an increment of exaggeration here, that there was a 30-inch hen that he threw every fly in his box at that wouldn't move, likely because she was waiting for a moose calf or something to cross the creek. But I want to share with you what Dave Hettinger, the outfitter who donated that trip, said. He said, in the last 5 years, magic has happened here. TU is different than a lot of conservation outfits. They don't just talk about problems, they get stuff done. A tremendous example of the power of public-private partnerships can be found on the Monongahela in West Virginia. A few years ago, the chiefs of the NRCS and the U.S. Forest Service got together and said, what would happen if we took all that knowledge and technical skill that the Forest Service has, and we work with Trout Unlimited and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, whose job is to do private land conservation, and they have similar great expertise. And we tried to extend the cold water influence of the brook trout streams off the flank of the Monongahelas down onto adjacent private lands. And so we started to do that. I'm happy to report that in the past few years, probably 3 or 4 years, we've done 60 miles of stream restoration or riparian restoration. We've decommissioned over 65 miles of road, and I had the pleasure of actually sitting in a track hoe and dropping the bucket and pulling out a little bit of that road. Our insurance people aren't here, are they? And we've reconnected 36 miles of habitat that were previously inaccessible to brook trout. Now, I'll tell you that when we started this project, we had 2 or 3 full-time staff in West Virginia. Today, because of that partnership with the Forest Service and the NRCS, and because of that level of accomplishment that we're able to achieve, we have 13 full-time staff working in West Virginia. And every summer, we hire an additional 20 to 30 seasonal employees to get this work done. This is this is a completely replicable model. Anywhere that we are doing watershed restoration, we can partner with the NRCS and take that work to scale. Anywhere that we have home rivers initiatives that are located within or near public lands, we can work with the Forest Service and replicate this all around the country. I was really looking forward this year to coming up here and doing a big victory dance, talking about Bristol Bay. But unfortunately, we have been sidetracked by litigation, and that process is playing out. And I fully expect within a few months we'll have a much clearer picture of where we're going to go there. But that doesn't mean that we weren't still working very actively in Alaska. We had 2 major wins this year that I wanted to share with you. One was on the Susitna River. The state had long been proposing building a massive hydroelectric power dam. The Susitna harbors one of the top 5 Chinook-producing streams in the world. And this is just a really bad place to put a major hydroelectric dam. And happily, late in the spring, the state announced that they were abandoning their plans to do that, and the Susitna will remain as it is, a wild and free river that produces amazing catches of Chinook salmon. The very next day, completely unrelated, the U.S. Forest Service released a draft management plan for the Tongass National Forest. This is our largest national forest. It harbors 25% of the world's temperate rainforests, and it is a veritable fish factory. The Forest Service announced that they were not only going to end or phase out old-growth logging in the Tongass, which has been a real problem for a while, but we had worked with partners in the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy to identify the top 77 fish-producing watersheds in the Tongass. We creatively called that the Tongass 77. And the Forest Service announced in their draft plan that they were going to protect every single one of those watersheds. So those of you who heard Governor Bullock speak yesterday heard a little bit about this topic. I liken this, in the east we have these cicadas that emerge from the earth every 17 years, and they create these little holes in the earth, and they climb the trees, and then they fall, and they get into your hair, and they make a mess on your windshield and on the sidewalk. Your dog eats them. They're a real nuisance. Well, 30 years ago, it was the Sagebrush Rebellion, and 15 years after that, we had the county supremacy movement, and now we have this effort to transfer our public lands from public ownership to either private hands or to transfer them to state lands. Now, we love working with our state partners. The state DNRs that we work with are outstanding. But the fact is, as these pie charts show, that states manage their trust lands for one reason, and one reason alone: to generate revenue that they plow back in for schools and roads. And that's just fine. That's a good use of state lands. But that's not what our multiple use public lands are for. Now, lest you in the East or the Midwest think this is a Western issue, just recently the state of Wisconsin, the state legislature passed a bill that instructs the governor to identify 10,000 acres of state public land previously open for hunting and fishing and sell that to raise revenue for the state coffers. Now, this is an extreme offense. The public lands are quite literally what remain of the great westward expansion of the United States. In a very real sense, they are the anvil upon which the character of this nation was hammered out. These are lands that we should be, they are not simply a birthright. These are a legacy, an inheritance that we need to pass down to future generations. This is one of those issues that seems like it's under the radar, but there have been 50 bills that have been introduced in state legislatures and in the US Congress to take our public lands away from us. This is an abhorrence, and we need to really stand vigilant, and TU has done just a phenomenal job of that. I think, is today the last day of September? Yesterday was. So yesterday culminated something, and again, Kirk, we may need to work on our marketing, something we creatively called 30 Days of Public Lands. But for those of you who are on social media, you may have seen some of the videos that were produced, or the reports that were produced, or the testimonials from regular people and some famous people who really love to use and care about their public lands. We generated something like 1.8 million impressions. 1.8 million people saw that material, and it's just vital that we maintain that focus on keeping public lands in public ownership. How is this work possible? This is unbelievable to me. This is the most motivating chart that I see all year long. On average, each TU chapter donates somewhere between, or generates somewhere between 1,500 to 1,700 hours of community service to the places they live. They're teaching kids to fish, they're helping wounded veterans to heal, they're doing stream cleanups, they're doing a whole host of activities that make their communities better places to live. And because of that goodwill that you generate in your communities, we are able to leverage that at the national level. And we've seen significant growth in TU over the past 5 or 6 years. We've essentially doubled in size as an organization because of the tailwind that we're able to draft off that you create through all that good work that you do in your local communities. Now, you'll note in FY16, we had a flat to slightly declining budget. That was intentional. We finally realized that we had grown very quickly, very fast, and we had a very lean operation, and we needed to take the time to put in place the proper technology, the proper people, the proper financial controls that befit a $50 million a year organization on our way to $100 million. And so we've taken this year to do that. And we've turned over essentially almost our entire finance and accounting team. And our new colleague, Matt Renaud, will come up after I speak, and he will give you a little bit more of that detail. But it was a necessary and needed step, and I'm now confident that our business operations are as best in class as our conservation, volunteer, and science operations. Now, I did a lot of research for this talk. I think I've read just about everything that still remains that Art Neumann wrote. And one of the things that Art said, he became the second, it's often reported he was the first, but he was actually the second executive director of TU. And he firmly believed that he needed to spend 75% of his time on the road creating, at that point, new chapters, meeting with state and federal agencies, and as Art would put it, preaching the gospel of Trout Unlimited. After many, many months of looking at cash flow charts and making sure we had really good grant compliance and putting in place proper financial controls with our great team back at the Arlington office, I decided to take Art at his word. I don't think I spent 75% of the time on the road, but I spent a significant amount of time going out and visiting with chapters and councils and projects that the national organization was running on the ground. And one of the first places I went was up to Adams County, Pennsylvania, where, and now you're probably wondering why I'm showing a picture of that's a largemouth bass. It's a very large largemouth bass. It's an 11-pound, 3-ounce largemouth that was caught from a place called Spruce Run Reservoir in Pennsylvania in 1983. It's the state record largemouth. If you couldn't, and I'm fairly certain that fish was released, I'm guessing here. So it's not as though he wanted to go back and put that fish in the reservoir, but that reservoir doesn't exist any longer because the Cumberland Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited and the Adams County chapter and 2 other chapters worked with the state of Pennsylvania to basically reconstruct what was an historic brook trout stream. And you should see this stream. It has all these now natural meanders in it. They revegetated the entire area where the reservoir was. They have great woodcock hunting there now, and it's totally open and accessible to the public. This was a project that was anticipated to take 5 years. Thanks to the 200 hours of labor that were provided by the local chapters there, it got done in 2 years. I have such respect for our friends in Arizona and New Mexico. They are such great advocates of native fish restoration. And I wanted to go down there to talk about the importance of protecting Southwest native trout. These are our southernmost native trout species, Apache, Gila, and Rio Grande cutthroat trout. They exist, as they have for millennia, in some of the harshest climates, places that other trout simply could not survive. Incredibly low flows, incredibly warm temperatures. And it would be easy to say, given the increase in drought and floods and big fires that are extirpating a lot of their habitat, it would be easy to write off those populations and say, no, we should be focused more on the core of troutdom. But it's exactly because of their ability to withstand these harsh extremes that would be lethal for most trout, that we have to do a better job of understanding their genetics and their life history, and what is it that allows them to survive. And when I went down to the Southwest and we learned all about our work there to protect Southwest native trout, which is a major priority for the organization, but what completely blew me away was the Old Pueblos chapter commitment to working with our veterans. They did last year 56 outings with Project Healing Waters. Now think about that for a second. Think about how many weeks there are in a year. They did 56 outings. They helped well over 100 veterans to heal, and they are an essential part of a massive effort by this organization. I think we have 270 chapters right now that are helping wounded veterans to heal. We served over 4,000 veterans this past year. This is great and important work, and the Old Pueblo chapter sets a great example for us. I went to visit our friends at the North Bay chapter in Northern California, and they've been working for 30 years on a little tribute. Well, they've been working on the entire Lagunitas Creek for 30 years. But the picture that you see here is a place called Devil's Gulch. And if you look in the upper left of the photograph, you'll see a little waterfall. That's a sill plate that was installed 30 years ago. We probably wouldn't do this today. But they did it to create and scour a pool at the base where adult fish that were returning could pause and rest in their upward migration, their upstream migration. What's really cool about this project is, this is Eric Young on the left. He's the great council chair we have from California. But that's Mike Cronin. Mike Cronin remembers as a 14-year-old boy participating with his father, a local legend in California, Leo Cronin, in installing that sill plate. And what we were there to see was the installation of that large wood that you see down in the bottom of the photograph. They installed a whole, probably 14 or 15 of these really interlocked large wood insertions that provide cover and habitat for juvenile and adult steelhead. But this is just a perfect example of the intergenerational nature of our work. I went to Idaho largely to celebrate a Big Wood Home Rivers initiative. This is one of our newer Home Rivers initiative. But while I was there, what was truly remarkable was the passion that a number of donors and volunteers felt for recovering our upriver stocks of salmon and steelhead to the Snake River Basin. These are fish that migrate from the Pacific Ocean. They stop feeding as soon as they enter the freshwater. They drop their scales, and then they travel 8,000 miles, climbing 800 feet in elevation, to return to their natal streams to spawn. We're then there, and then they die. And their decaying bodies provide the nutrients that allow those systems to continue over time. The problem we have is that, as you see in this photograph here, along the Columbia and then into the Snake, each of those red dots represents a dam. And we have mortality for adults that are migrating upstream at each of those dams of 5 to 10%. And the downstream migration, when the juvenile smolts are being pushed downstream, they suffer mortality of 10 to 15% per dam. You can do the math and see that this is not a sustainable proposition. This has been made much more complicated in recent years by warming temperatures, which have turned those reservoirs into lethal bathtubs that are frying those smolt as they migrate downstream. The good news is, and I think the reason that people in Idaho were so heartened when I was there, was that this year a federal judge said, enough. For 15 years, we've been kicking the can down the road on recovering these anadromous fish, these upriver stocks. These are listed under the Endangered Species Act. We have a legal obligation to recover these fish, to keep them from becoming extinct, and the judge insisted for the first time that the federal agencies now must look at dam removal as an option in recovering these fish. It's the first time that's ever been required. And since it wasn't required before, the federal government wasn't willing to go there. Now, I am quite confident that the science of salmon recovery will ultimately take us to the point that those dams have to go. I don't see any other way around it. I don't know if some of you may have seen that John Oliver video with the salmon cannon, you know, where they shoot the salmon out of the cannon. I mean, that could be an option. I'm not sure how good that's going to be on reentry, but the fact is, that's what we think the answer is. But just like in the Klamath and just like in the Penobscot, what we want to do is create a forum where everyone can sit down and talk about this together as a community. And we want to get to a place where we can become advocates for those advocates of the status quo, the people who want to keep those dams in place. We want to figure out ways to make sure that they are made economically whole, that they don't suffer from dam removal. And in the same way, we want them to become just as passionate as we are for advocating for the recovery of these fish. And now, for the first time in 16 years, we believe that we will have a forum to make that actually happen. I had the pleasure of sitting down recently with the Secretary of Agriculture and the CEO of Coca-Cola, as well as our partners at the National Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy, to talk about a really cool effort that Coca-Cola is involved with. They have a commitment now as an organization, as a corporation, to replenish all of the water that they're using in their products. And they're doing that through watershed restoration. And here in Montana, we have a great example of that on the Sun River, where we've worked with partners in the Bureau of Reclamation, local irrigators, local ranchers, to retool how they were watering. And we've been able to secure 20 CFS, 9,000 acre-feet of additional flow in the Sun River. The results of that is that we've seen wild trout populations double over time because of that additional water. Now on Comanche Creek, which is in New Mexico, it's a tributary to the Rio Castilla watershed, which is a really vital watershed for Rio Grande cutthroat trout. The reason it's so important is that historically we thought we could draw a little, basically block off headwater habitats, literally install physical blockages to keep invading rainbows or browns or brook trout from getting into these small watersheds where Rio Grande cutthroat trout persist, because they introgress or interbreed or outcompete them. The problem is we've learned over time that these big fires that we're experiencing now on a more regular basis can then come in and wipe out those habitats. So we have to create what are called meta-populations, populations of fish that can have those intact headwaters, but then move down through a connected system in response to flood and fire and drought and fulfilling their own life histories. The Rio Castillo watershed is the only so-called metapopulation that we have of Rio Grande cutthroat trout. And Comanche Creek is an important tributary there. So there we worked with the National Forest Foundation, the Valle Vidal Grazing District, other partners to change some grazing practices, and in the process we did 300 acres of riparian restoration. We effectively doubled the length, the depth of the water table in that area, and think we've recovered about 600 acre-feet of water. Now, I know when I first heard this, I thought, 600 acre-feet, 9,000 acre-feet, but in these really dry, isolated populations where you're basically in semi-arid desert, that small increment of water can be the essential difference in the survival and recovery of these fish. Again, yesterday the governor mentioned the Smith River. There we have a Canadian, a multinational mining company that wants to build a massive copper mine in the headwaters of the Smith on a place called Sheep Creek. I don't know what it is about these Canadian mining companies that want to build all these massive mines in our best trout water, but they've proposed doing that in the Smith. And the Smith it's not just a Montana gem, this is truly a national gem. It's the only river in Montana that you need to get a permit to float. It takes 5 days to float the 60 miles, and the scenery is stunning and the fishing is fantastic. And the problem with this copper mine is that the deposit is high in sulfites. And as those are exposed to air through mining, they will leach acid mine drainage. And we all know what happens when you mix acid mine drainage with trout habitat. It's not good for the fish. And so we're working very hard with the Montana Council and other partners to make sure that this mine isn't built, and even more important, to put in place the laws and the regulations in the state that would prohibit this kind of mine from being even considered in the future. I had the pleasure of participating in the one bug on the Upper Delaware this year. The one bug, or rather, the Upper Delaware is it's a really cool fishery. There were no trout there in the 50s and 60s. And then the city of New York bought a ton of land up in the Catskills to basically protect their water supply. As a result of that, this is why New York City doesn't, like most major metropolitan areas, they don't have to have multi-billion dollar water filtration systems because they've protected the source of their water. The problem is that that system is governed by a consent decree from the Supreme Court that dates back to 1954. And there were no trout. There was no even consideration of trout back in 1954. And as a result, what we have today, we have two basic problems in a river system that already is among the finest wild trout fisheries in the East. And with minor corrections that I'll talk about in a second, could be, and I know this is going to be heresy here in Montana, the finest wild trout fishery in the country. Show me. Just take me out and show me. So, I lost my thread. So, I got all excited there. I was like, this is a good con. I mean, I could score a lot of fishing out of this. So, the basic problem that we have in that system is twofold. Number one, they manage it largely for drinking water. So when the drinking water needs of New York City essentially are met, they shut the river off. And so you'll have a river that's at bank full, healthy river, great bug populations, everything's perfect. Then they shut it down and it becomes a narrow channel. And all those aquatic insects that are in the riverbed, all those fry that are in the shallow water, they're left high and dry. The other problem we have is that in the summertime, probably for a 2 or 3 week period, we're just a little bit short on base flow, and so the water can become lethal for trout. And there are mechanisms now for working with the multi-state parties to get additional water in there. But often this happens on like a Friday afternoon, and you got to call Jim, who's on vacation with his family, and if it takes a day or two, it's probably too late. The happy news is that this year, the Croton Reservoir, which had been offline for about 10 years while they were working on it, came back online. And that reservoir will produce about 290 million acres of water, 290 gallons of water, 290 million gallons of water a day. That is more than enough to meet the summer needs of the fish. And we're quite confident that based on the really hard work of our chapters and councils in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, and our friends who are working diligently on this daily at the Friends of the Upper Delaware River. We're quite confident that we can work with the 4 states to ensure that they stop those yo-yo flows. So good things are in the future of the Upper Delaware. Another one of our newest Home Rivers initiative is the Headwaters of the Snake River initiative, and I wanted to talk to you about this for 2 reasons. This came about because the Jackson Hole chapter approached TU National and said, hey, we're willing to put up $100,000 if you all match it, and then we can put a person on the ground and conduct restoration on some of the headwaters of the Snake. These are great rivers like the Gros Ventre and the Hoback. And as you all know, when you put one of these TU staff people on the ground, they are alchemists. They turn $200,000 into $1.7 million in actual project work. And so we agreed to that, and that work is now underway. But the other thing that is really unique about this project is that in Wyoming, they don't allow trout in the classroom in that state because they don't want those releases in their wild and native fisheries. So they have a program called Adopt a Trout. And the idea behind Adopt a Trout is that you put pit tags or conduct telemetry studies on fish, and you watch where they migrate throughout the system. And what we're doing this year is this summer, over 200 children participated in that study, and they looked at where fish migrated in the Hoback. And we'll be working with our state and federal partners there to look at that research, to look at that data, and determine what stream restoration we should be focusing on next year. It's a great example of what we call STEM, or in TU's case, stream learning opportunities. Science, technology, recreation, engineering, arts, and math. And we're applying that all over the country, but this is a great example of how we're not only applying that angler science that Jack Williams talks so cogently about, we're actually using the results of it to inform our work. When I went up to see Art early in the year, I also went to see our friends at the Wege Foundation, who have been supporting our work on the Rogue. And I saw on a little tributary of the Rogue this partial dam that is blocking passage. It's on a place called Rum Creek, and it blocks passage for about 9 miles of upstream migration for fish. Several months later, I'm happy to report that that river now looks like that river. It is, in fact, that river on the upper right corner. Those are vegetation mats that you see along the side, and within a season, that'll be all greened out, and we'll go back in and plant willows and make this a really first-class wild trout fishery. What was really novel about this project, though, was that 1,200 students from the surrounding area have all been a part of this work on the Rogue. And I'm the father of young children, and if you actually evaluate, well, how much work are you actually getting out of those kids? It's probably not that significant, but it's not the actual work that they're providing that matters. It's what they do when they go home, and they tell their parents about this, and they become excited and interested in conservation. And then when they grow up, and they become advocates for the river, and the next time somebody wants to put a pipeline in across there or build a highway along that river, they're going to say, no, we don't want to do that. That river defines our community. When we can get to that place where kids are the most effective advocates for our work, then we know our job is done. This is a great story. I have to look these kids' name up because I always forget it. This is at the Southeast Regional Meeting. I had the pleasure of meeting Mason and Palmer Kasprowitz. So these guys, they got their grandfather's fly tying kit. He had stopped tying, and they got into it, and they're now 13 and 14 years old. They were 12 and 13 at the time. And they got into fly tying, and they thought it was really cool, and this is what they say. This is their business model. We want to study engineering in college, and each year tuition seems to grow faster than our college funds. So we decided to launch our own business and save any and all profits for college. That's why flies equals MC squared. Money for college for 2 brothers. So Flies by 2 Brothers they're one of 450 TU businesses, we call them, all around the country, large and small. From our friends at Sims, who opened up their doors and let us in there the other evening, and Orvis, big companies like those two, to really small mom and pop fly shops, or in this case, Flies by 2 Brothers. We have 450 businesses around the country that are paying it forward, that understand that essential connection between cold water fisheries, healthy habitat, and their businesses. And that number is only going to grow. We fully expect to have over 500 TU businesses by the end of next year. Now, it's not all work and no play. I do occasionally get to wet a line. And I showed this picture up here. We had a great fishing trip on the Bighorn River this year with John Christensen was there, and Kirk Dieter, Tim Romano, Tom Reed. We had a wonderful time. But I put this up here so I could largely read this quote from Art Neumann. Art says, "And don't forget, while you're doing this for trout, in an indirect way, you're also helping yourself. We are the most affluent, the most cultured, and the most advanced society the world has ever known. But this same society has also produced such a horribly high-speed, complex, and frustrating way of life that most of us have an awful time living with it. It's imperative that we have some place where we can go periodically to wash our minds clean, unwind and recharge, and return reconditioned and fit to live with this rat race for another period." So I'm coming to the close here. I am fairly certain that Art Neumann must have known my favorite writer, Wendell Berry, even though Art was from Michigan and Wendell Berry hails from Kentucky. After I met with Art, and I couldn't validate that because I uncovered this essay after Art had passed away, sadly. Wendell Berry wrote an essay in 2012 when he won the National Award for the Humanities. It was called "It All Turns on Affection." And he says that there's a certain kind of person in America that he calls stickers. And I think his definition of stickers embodies Art Neumann. He says a sticker is someone who settles and loves the life they have made and the place that they have made in it. Stickers are motivated by affection, by such love for a place and its life that they want to preserve and remain in it. I think it's almost by definition that you are all stickers too. You are all here for your affection for one another and your affection for these lands and waters that we care so deeply about and give so much to us and ask for so little in return. Berry went on to write, "The word affection and the terms of value that cluster around it, love, care, sympathy, mercy, forbearance, respect, and reverence, have histories and meanings that raise the issue of worth. We should, as our culture has warned us over and over again, give our affection to things that are true, just, and beautiful." True, just, and beautiful. Is there anything that's more true than spending time with a child and helping them to discover the wonder of nature through trout in the classroom or through a youth camp or through a teen summit and discover the wonder of God's creation? Couldn't there be anything more just than this hairy notion that we can take collective action and help to recover salmon from the Pacific Ocean all the way back to the sawtooths? And is there anything more beautiful than holding a wild trout in your hands and thinking about that combination of habitat and skill and luck before then carefully, lovingly releasing it? But I think it's important to leave the last word on how effective you all are as stickers to our first sticker in chief.
My life was so enriched by my association with Trout Unlimited that I feel I owe them my life. They provided the opportunity for me to utilize some talents God had given me that otherwise might have gone to waste. And in the end, the entire period that I spent with the organization in the early days was probably the best example of my utilization of those talents. I have lived just a fantastic life. It's pretty hard to even imagine anything better. And so to TU, I am eternally grateful for the opportunity they provided for me to do what I was able to do for them.
Thank you all so much. Have a great annual meeting.